Welcome everyone, my name is Simon Kelly. I'm the Curator, Head of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art here. I want to welcome you all to the Olin Endowed lecture. This program is part of an ongoing series to explore the intersection of commerce and the arts, and it's made possible through the Olin Lecture Fund. So this lecture is taking place in person, but it's also being live streamed, so I'd like to welcome all of our audience members, whether they're here, in person, or virtually. So it's a pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, Seave Greenwald. Diana is the William and Leah Poorvu Interim Curator of the collection at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Prior to joining the Gardner, she was an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral curatorial fellow at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., working in the Department of American and British Paintings and Modern Prints and Drawings. She received a DPhil in History from the University of Oxford, and before doctoral study, Diana earned an MPhil in Economic and Social History, also from Oxford, and received a bachelor's degree in art history from Columbia University. So excellent places you studied, very impressive. So part of the uniqueness of Diana's approach is that she's both an art historian and economic historian. Her work uses both statistical and qualitative analyses to explore the relationship between art and broader social and economic change during the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly in the United States and France. And her first book, I think this is a cover for the first book, Painting by Numbers, Data-Driven Histories of 19th Century Art, was published by Princeton University Press in 2021 and has been very well received. Diana's lecture this evening is entitled Painting by Numbers, Creating Data-Driven Histories of Art. She's going to give us some insight into her methods and also look particularly, I believe, at a case study of the output of 19th century women artists and the ways in which domestic responsibilities informed and complicated their practice. The study of 19th century women artists is really a crucially important area of scholarship, so I'm excited to hear more of what Diana's going to say and what her contribution to this field is going to be. So with that, I'd like to welcome Diana to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. You'll have to bear with me. As Simon mentioned, this book came out in 2021, so I've given most of my book talks from my kitchen table. So this is a little different. This is a little bit bigger than the screen of my laptop, but you can imagine I'm thrilled to be here. So, of course, what are we going to start this lecture with? An absolutely shameless plug for my own book. No, but what I will say is that what we're going to talk about today is largely drawn from this work, which was based on my dissertation. So if you like what you hear or you're interested to learn more, please do check it out. Great. So you signed up to come to a lecture about art, and you are looking at an IBM punch card. And you're probably thinking that you kind of got hoodwinked here, but I promise that it's relevant. So in the 1960s, a kind of legendary scholar of American art named Jules Prown, who taught at Yale for many, many years, put up an image just like this one at a conference called CAA, which is basically the principal conference for art historians. And he got booed for putting up something which was at the time cutting-edge computing technology. But what he was trying to show and prove is that actually he had used cards like these while he was working on a catalog raisonné of works by a famous American artist, an 18th century artist named John Singleton Copley, and he'd used statistics to study correlations between Copley's sitters and their social and economic backgrounds. So basically, if someone was a minister, did they commission a certain type of portrait? Were people who were from, say, Gloucester, just north of Boston, versus Boston proper, did they have different tastes in medium for pastel or oil? He was gathering all of this information for, like I said, a catalog raisonné, which means a list of all the paintings that an artist has made. And he decided to try and tease out these social and economic relationships. And he actually found some, which is really, really cool, right? And despite the fact that he found interesting trends using statistical analyses related to art history, his approach was widely rejected. And he said something in an essay reflecting on the experience that I think really helps us situate some of this work in current art historical scholarship. He said, "On the basis of this experience, I am convinced that the computer can and will be used fruitfully for other studies in art history. The computer can be especially helpful for projects which require any kind of quantification. However," he said that he knew his colleagues would resist the more complex uses that he had demonstrated with statistics. Basically what he was saying is if, we could find really interesting trends maybe with his approach, however, he thought his colleagues would mostly be interested in looking up information, that they would use computers to find the date of Robert Hooper, not how Robert Hooper's socioeconomic background influenced his taste for art. And I'd say that Crown has largely been correct. Art historians love looking up things on Google, like the rest of us, but we don't necessarily use computers all that much to dig into these more complex social and economic questions. So, I've done my best to try and correct that, or at least step into the breach a little bit, and I'm going to kind of give you an outline of where we're going today. So the first thing is I'm going to talk a little bit about economic history and what the heck it even is, and why it can be useful as a guide for creating data-driven histories of art. Second, I'll go through a little bit about what historical data exists to teach us about the art world and its past, what we can learn from that sort of macroscopic, zoomed-out, data-driven view, and then, as Simon alluded to, we'll dig into a case study specifically about women artists. Okay, economic history is a guide for data-driven histories of art. And this is the second time you're going to see this slide. Maybe this is even worse than the IBM punch card, but I promise there's a point. So we're actually looking at heights in adult men over time from 1896 to 1996. Why am I showing you this slide? So when I was a student of economic history, there are many studies that I had to read and learn about where people use height as a proxy for health. So any scholar interested in human health in the past often uses sources of data about height to understand how healthy a population was. Generally, this works pretty well. However, there are some instances where the height data, we need to be a little bit skeptical of what it's showing us. So, for example, there were a series of studies that used, I believe they're French military records, to look at the history of human health in France. However, they learned after doing lots of analysis that in fact, the draft in the French army, so the source of these military records, had a height minimum. What does this mean? It means that all the people in the data set had to be a certain height. They looked taller than the actual total population was. This means that if you studied them, the historical population looked healthier than it was. And this is an example of something that in economic history we call selection or sample bias. When the sample that you're studying from history is actually a biased representation of the whole population that you're interested in, that can really compromise your results. Now, in art history, what can sample or selection bias look like? And I would argue that it could look like a historical canon, that the artworks that you see that have survived, that have come down to us through history, are actually a tiny sample of what was ever produced. Now the problem is, there's not sort of a height minimum equivalent for getting into an art historical canon, for getting into a museum, or at least not one that's as clear as, are you 5'2" or taller? And so you're kind of left with samples of art that might be biased in one way or another, but we're not quite sure how. And that's what we're going to dig into. So, the historical data of the art world. What are the types of data sources out there that we can actually use to understand whether what we're studying in art history is actually representative of what was ever produced in the past? So I will say, and I'll add a caveat here, I'm very much a 19th century person, and the nice thing about the 19th century is there are lots of lists of things. There was super cheap printing technology, and so all sorts of exhibitions had a little brochure that went with it, and then a lot of really, really patient scholars, like way more patient than I am, went through all those things and created sources like this. What are we looking at? We're looking at basically a compilation that lists all the artists who displayed works of art at something called the National Academy of Design, which was in New York. I'll talk about that a little bit more later about the NAD as an institution. And so what we see is actually name of artist, title, date, some other data points here, all in one giant data source. And we can digitize this through transcription. So what you're looking at is basically the spreadsheet version of a long list. And suddenly, a little bit like Jules Prown, who was creating his list of Copley paintings, our list is not just a list, but a data source that we can analyze. There's another kind of readily available source of data out there. Museum websites. This is from the National Gallery of Art, where I was working when I was writing this book. Luckily I had a very patient boss who let me write a book while I was also working for her. This is the front end that you might see if you visit a collection website, but the key, and this is for all the museum nerds out there, is there's a back end. It's called TMS in this instance. A lot of major museums use it, and this actually exports to a spreadsheet. So, just because museums have been trying to create publicly available cataloging sort of sources and information about their collections, we end up with something that can give us massive amounts of data in Excel just with one export button. So those are two examples of some of the data that we can use. Okay, I've told you about the data sources, but what the heck can we even learn from it, right? I'll give you a couple of quick examples from the book before we dive in. And this is actually from data about the Paris Salon, which was a major exhibition in 19th century France. I know Simon has worked on it extensively, and I like this one because it's kind of fun. So what are we looking at? We're looking at portraits shown in Paris over time. And what we're looking at is the percentage of portraits that are Bourbon family members, so all the Louis, right? And Bonapartes, all the Napoleons, etc. And we've got time over here. So we look at this. So no Bonapartes, right? Napoleon's not really a thing yet. We see an increase in the number of portraits, and then a rapid decline for the history buffs in the room. That's the French Revolution. See a Louis XVI. Napoleon, right? Napoleon is emperor. He's deposed. This is called the Bourbon Restoration. And so we see these kings who are trying to come back just doubling down on portraiture to show themselves. And then they fall out of power. And then we've got Napoleon III, right? So immediately, zooming out, we can actually see politics in action on the walls of the Paris Salon. Now, this won't be massively surprising to a lot of art historians who would think, of course, the Paris Salon is political, right? Makes sense. Although I still think it's pretty cool that this kind of has a bit of a guillotine shape, but anyway. But we can learn more surprising things, and to get back to our theme about selection bias. So, this is a little bit of inside baseball, but you're going to have to bear with me. What we're looking at here, again at the Paris Salon, is actually about kind of subjects of paintings. So we have landscape paintings, and the number of them shown over time. And then we have rural genre paintings, which are images often of peasants working in the countryside, etc., including by famous artists like Jean-Francois Millet. It's especially for you, Simon. But what I want to point out here is that in the art historical literature, there was sort of a moment in the 1970s where people talked a lot about how much rural genre painting there was on display. There's a theory that as France is getting more urban over time and more industrial, there's this yearning for kind of a rural past, which is just exploding on the walls of 19th century French exhibition venues. I'm kind of going over the top with that characterization, but just so you get the idea. But what do we actually see? Rural genre painting is a very, very small and fairly stable share. And if I showed this to you in percentages, it's going to be the same story, of paintings shown at this major French exhibition, right? So what happened is a lot of those authors who were kind of talking about that theory and focusing on it had chosen a select number of famous artists. I mentioned Millet. There's also Courbet. There are others who they'd really studied. And by focusing on these artists that produced one type of art, they got the impression that it was everywhere. But if we zoom out, and we don't just go painting by painting, or famous artist by famous artist, the story changes a little bit. And maybe that kind of tie between this big social change and industrialization, and this very particular type of genre painting, isn't as strong as it once seemed to be. We'll do one more before we dig into our case study. So this is data from the Royal Academy. And I should say, all of these are based on titles, right? So we could talk about, and I really invite it in the question and answer session, how well titles are actually a proxy for subject matter, but we can dive into that when hopefully you grill me at the end of this. And so something that was really interesting is when I was looking at data from the Royal Academy, so again, they kind of like, this is a principal exhibition venue, in this case in London. I was looking for images actually of British colonies. I sort of expected there at the height of British imperialism for there to be many depictions of places that were under British colonial rule. And what do we find? It's actually the opposite, which is really interesting. Tons of images of home, of England, of the British landscape, and only down here do we start to see places that are actually under British imperial control. So there's almost a washing, pushing to the side of depictions of any sort of imperial enterprise. It's excluded from the walls of the Royal Academy, which again is a really interesting thing that we can learn only by zooming out and seeing some of these quantitative trends. But we're going to dig into a complete research question, not just descriptive statistics, as the economists would call it. And for those in the room who have read any Linda Nochlin, this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek response to her. She's this like mythic feminist art historian. And so why she rhetorically asked in a famous essay, why have there been no great women artists? And of course her answer, well, I won't go into the whole historiography of it, but I promise you it's an ironic question. She's not implying that there are no great women artists. And I'm going to start with a little bit of a personal anecdote. When I was a fellow at the National Gallery of Art, what do they always make the fellows do, right? The curatorial fellows, because we're not fancy full curators yet, we do all the cataloging. So when anything new comes in, it's basically our job to measure and put it into the system. And I happened to be cataloging two separate sets of accessions while I was a fellow at the NGA. And the first one was a lithograph like this, which is from the Guerrilla Girls, right? Hopefully, I won't ask for a show of hands, but if people have heard of the Guerrilla Girls, they're a feminist artist collective, and they ask really funny questions that are quite cutting, right? So in this case, do women have to be naked to get into the Met? And what did they do? They did statistics in the 80s. They walked around and they actually kind of counted the number of nudes and the number that were women, 85%, right? And that less than 5% of the artists in the modern art section were women. And they used this as sort of an ad, and they tried to draw attention to exclusion of women in the art world. So I had this kind of 5% number in my head while I was cataloging this. And I was also cataloging in my other department And I happen to be cataloging a collection of 19th century American still life painting that had been recently given by Bill and Abby Gertz. And I quickly realized, as I'm going through this collection of, I think, about 120 paintings, that there are a lot of women artists, right? So the 5% number that the Guerrilla Girls put up, that was about equivalent to what was in the 19th century American art collection at the NGA. It was around 6% women artists. And suddenly, I'm looking at this collection of still life painting, and it's at least 18% women artists. Still, not huge, but 3 times as much. And so I started to wonder, is this just a fluke? Do the Gertz collect a lot of women artists, or is something bigger going on here? And it turned out I actually had the data to try and figure that out. So I showed you a list before of people who showed at the National Academy of Design. I'll tell you a little bit more about it here. So the NAD was an art school and exhibition venue in New York that was, unlike in Europe where there's sort of like one principal venue per country, let's say, the US, it's a little bit more distributed. You have the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, the Boston Athenaeum up in Boston. There are a range of different centers, but the NAD is certainly one of the most important ones, and its position in New York gave it a certain primacy of position. And because I had those lists that I showed you, I actually could tell who showed at the National Academy of Design from 1800, well actually a little bit before, 1780, what am I going to say? No, sorry, excuse me, 1810 to 1900. There's a full list. And so I could check using an algorithm that basically read artists' first names or an article, right? Miss, Mrs., etc. How many women artists are showing over time at the National Academy of Design? And so this is what you get when you do that. And so the first thing you'll notice is that kind of 5% number, right, is representative of maybe the first kind of part of the NAD's existence. So if we're thinking about the collection of 19th century art, you're like, oh, well, maybe that's vaguely representative if that collection stopped around 1855. But then you see this explosion from 1860 forward. So basically from the Civil War forward. And routinely, women artists are making up between 15 and 20% of exhibitors. So what's the first thing we're learning from this? That let's say the population of 19th century American artists, or a sample of them who might be collected by major museums, there are actually way more women in that sample of artists than are ending up in the museum collection. This is kind of them at the source. The other thing I wanted to see was how many of the paintings exhibited were still life paintings, right? I was kind of cataloging this collection of still life. There seemed to be a lot of women artists in this still life collection. And so I could also do those numbers. And so you're seeing them here. And still life for, kind of the art history nerds in the room is often dismissed as like the quote lowest genre, right? Like landscape, portraiture, big history paintings, that's the big glorious stuff. In our history, still life is supposed to be this little thing in the corner and has historically been less respected. But there's still quite a bit of it that we see at the NAD. And the really interesting thing that happens is when you combine the two. Okay, so in blue, we're looking at the percentage of works by female artists that were still life shown at the National Academy of Design. So all this craziness here, by the way, like the 50% and down and up, it's kind of a result, not kind of a result, it is a result of what we call a small denominator problem. There were so few individual women showing at the National Academy of Design that any time 2 of them did a still life painting, it's suddenly 50% of the total. However, things get more regular after 1860, but we can see women are showing still life around 30% of the time. It drops off here as they actually move to another school and exhibition venue, the Art Students League, that's more favorable to them. Men, on average, really quite steadily are showing 10% or less still life. So it means the women are doing tons of still life painting, the men, very little. Why does this matter, or why is this interesting? Well, when we take these trends in the actual 19th century, and we compare them to the holdings of a major museum, in this case the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I chose to pair with the NAD data because actually a bunch of kind of big wigs at the National Academy of Design served on the board of the Met when it opened. You're seeing their American wing here, their American art collection. A lot of them, it's kind of a pipeline from the National Academy of Design into the Met. And so let's look at the statistics for the Met's holdings in American art. So if we look at all fine arts, right, there are about 6,000 works in that department. They're not so far from the Guerrilla Girls. They're at the 6% number. Now, if we look at still life paintings in the American wing, 23% of the makers, right, are women. Suddenly, that's where all the women are. They're doing still life painting, and the Met matches the NAD data, right? But what I really want you to focus on is this number, which is the N. There are only 105 still life paintings in the Met's American wing collection of 6,000 works. Let's go back to this image. Does anyone see a still life painting? So what we see is that what gets collected, again in line with this kind of story of hierarchy of genres, is the big, heroic history painting, right, of course. Boitza, Washington crossing the Delaware. But even beyond, let's say, the really big things, there are a series of major landscapes on either side of this, if you guys have been to New York and seen this. But then we even have the genre paintings here, no still life. So what we're seeing first and foremost is that a genre in which women are active and we know is present in sort of historic exhibitions, right, is not actually making the leap into the museum collections that we use to study art history today. So that's kind of interesting and or distressing. But why? So we don't just want to sort of stop the story with that. Why are women so active in still life painting? And the kind of traditional story is that women are excluded from artistic education that would allow them to do something that isn't still life, and also that it's inappropriate for them to paint anything that sort of isn't fruit or flowers. So there is definitely some truth to this story, right? I'm not going to completely deny 19th century American Victorian convention, but it's not totally fair. What's really interesting is that women's arts education in the United States was quite a bit ahead of its European counterparts. Why? Because the art schools were private and needed money, and women were willing to pay tuition. So the state-sponsored schools in France or in England could much more easily exclude women pupils or kind of push them to the side. And women were allowed to take life drawing classes. We actually see one here. This is that were taking place at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Again, not to the same level as men, but you can't just end it with a supply side story that there are no women kind of students or art students who could do anything but still life. And this is where you're like, again, the non-art slides, they keep coming at you, but I promise there's the point. This is where the economics, or kind of economic history, can get really interesting. So this is going to be a bit of a side, but I promise we're going to come back to art history. So I was looking at these trends, and I was thinking about women in still life, and it can't just be etiquette that they're painting flowers more than other subjects. And it happened to be at the time that I was reading some work by an economic historian named Claudia Golden. She actually just published a great book called Career and Family. She's a labor economist at Harvard. And she's done a really convincing set of articles, and as I mentioned now, this book, about women in the labor force. Something kind of interesting is that economic historians study women in the labor force a lot because unlike men, their participation has changed quite a bit over time due to laws, social conventions, etc. But Claudia Golden was super interested in why the gender pay gap between men and women is so stubborn. And I'm sure I don't need to kind of brief everyone on that, but women generally earn less money than men, and she was trying to look for explanations as to why this is beyond just kind of straight sexism. I mean, we're not in a 19th century or even early 20th century where there were like marriage bars, and once you were married, you couldn't work. Why is this gap so stubborn? I would also add it's stubborn even as women outpace men in higher education and the number of advanced degrees that they're earning. And so Claudia Goldin landed on a theory which is really interesting about time constraint. So she studies all these different industries and all these different kind of fields, some of which where women and men have relative pay equity and others where there are massive gaps. And in the industries where there are massive gaps, she finds a couple of kind of common themes. One is that if the hours are super, super long, that's a problem. But beyond super long hours, it's if the hours are inflexible. So I want you to think about, and client-facing. So I want you to think about kind of bankers and lawyers, right? If the deal needs to get done, you have to work 16 hours, you have to be in a team with like, in some boardroom somewhere, and that's the job. And it turns out that type of time structure, where you're on somebody's schedule and it's really long, and you have to be client-facing, is really bad for women's achievement and compensation. And it's largely because those kinds of time demands are completely incompatible, or largely incompatible, with the domestic responsibilities that we know women often end up shouldering. I can now say this very personally as someone who has a 13-month-old daughter, that kids really do make everything more complicated when you're working. And so, on the flip side, there are industries that pay really, really well, that don't have these time structures, where women actually have pay equity with men. And the example that Claudia Goldin gives is pharmacists. So pharmacists used to be majority men when pharmacies were actually independently owned, they were small businesses, you were sort of like on the hook as the owner of your pharmacy to be on call all the time. Majority male industry. Walgreens, CVS, etc. have come in and taken over pharmacy, and now being a pharmacist is shift work. So again, highly paying, you have to be highly qualified, but you work a defined shift. You show up, you sign up for this 8-hour thing, when you're on, when you're off, and that's the job. And it turns out that now women dominate pharmacy. Shift work, where you can kind of come and go as you please, not as you please, but you've signed up for a specific shift, and work has a clear beginning and end, is much more compatible with having kids, being responsible for a family, all these domestic burdens that, you know, and I'll say, like, my husband is fantastic. He does half the cooking or more, right? There's still a creep in women's responsibility at home. And gosh knows, it was far worse historically. So, why am I bringing up these industry comparisons? What if we think about these industries and women's work and women's time constraint with respect to genres of painting? If I'm a portrait painter in 19th century America, I am completely at the demand of my clients. I work at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. If any of you have been, we have a massive portrait of our founder, Isabella Stewart Gardner, right in one of our galleries. Poor John Singer Sargent, the American painter who did that painting, spent 2.5 months with Gardner, day in and day out, as she asked him to rework her face again and again. He was client-facing. It was long, it was unpredictable. It was kind of like being a banker as a painter, to be a portrait painter. History paintings, huge, expensive, unpredictable kind of commissions where you don't know when you're gonna finish, all on spec. Landscape paintings in the 19th century US, you have to go on a long survey party often to the west, largely male dominated, which has its other problems, but you would be gone for months at a time. It's only still life painting that resembles more closely shift work, right? You can set up your fruit or your flowers in a corner. I should add, it was also sometimes a problem for women to have studio space of their own in the 19th century. And you can come and go as you please to this subject. You are the master of the time. The raspberries are not the master of the time unless they rot, of course, but we'll assume there are replacement raspberries. So I would argue that it's not just social convention that is leading women to be active in this particular genre, right? It is also time constraint. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. What's some other evidence that we can see that women artists might be more active in places, in artistic practices that are, for lack of a better term, more time efficient? The other place we can actually see this is also in media. So we're back to the American Wing at the Met, and here we're looking at male artists in the collection of the American Wing, and we're looking at the different media that their work is. So 45% drawings and pastels, so works on paper. Second one here is paintings, so oil on canvas, 12% watercolor, and then sculpture at 9.8%. And let's do the same comparison for women. And so the first thing I want you to see is that the number one category here is actually miniatures. So they're these tiny, tiny little portraits, also light sensitive. They're quite fast and finicky. Then we've got drawings and pastels, also works on paper, right? Watercolors, also works on paper. And I will say that works on paper, on the whole, are generally a little bit faster to complete than your oil on canvas. And then, last but not least, paintings, oil on canvas. So what we have is actually women are most active not only in still life, if we go by genre, but all of this is works on paper. Now, what's the irony for the curators in the room, or and the art enthusiasts in the room, of the fact that many of the women artists in the American Wing are represented by works on paper? These are all light sensitive. So actually, not only are women present in the genre that's least collected, when they are collected, we're looking at works of art that can't be shown all the time. So were we to go back to that view of the American Wing, you can't have any of the little miniatures or the drawings and pastels in that big hall on the walls where we see them. They have to be protected from light the vast majority of the time. So we have another source of sort of discrimination of being even aware of women artists in the sample of art history. So we're going to finish with a bit more of a qualitative case study. There are, of course, a couple graphs, because what would it be without this? But about an artist named Lily Martin Spencer, who is one of the most successful antebellum women American artists. She's primarily a genre painter, which is really interesting. She was born in Ohio to very, very progressive parents. They were actually busy trying to found like a communist, a Fourierist commune. So her parents are like radical feminists. They totally believe in educating their daughter to become an artist. They support her moving to New York to pursue this. So she has this kind of exceptional background. She's a phenom in her hometown. Like I said, she moves to New York. She actually ends up getting married to Benjamin Rush Spencer. This is him here. She's making fun of, I guess, the fact that he's terrible at grocery shopping. And the other really interesting thing is that Benjamin, so he's trained, we think, as a tailor, but he actually becomes a stay-at-home parent. Pretty radical for the 19th century. So the Spencers, she ends up giving birth to 13 children, 7 of whom lived until maturity. And we have her letters where she's writing home to her mother in Ohio about trying to get work done while having all these kids around, right? And it's stressful, and she's constantly looking for time. They think about hiring a maid, but they can't afford a maid because it's basically too expensive. But if she doesn't have a maid, she has no time to actually do her work because she's responsible for the house, even though in the 19th century, she has a husband who's staying at home to try and support her, right? And we actually see this in her productivity. So there's not quite like there's not an official catalog raisonné of Lily Martin Spencer's works, but there was a retrospective in the 70s, and so you can use that to extrapolate a little bit about how much she's produced over time. And so this is by decade. So we have this first decade, and I think she has 1 kid in this decade. She has 2 more children who live to maturity in this decade, and then the rest are born after this. It seems kid 4 really broke the camel's back here. I mean, and so what we're seeing is that even for a 19th century woman artist in an incredibly supportive and progressive environment, we know from the archival record, we know from her output, that she's still finding it fairly incompatible, the demands of a full-time artistic career, with marrying that with her domestic responsibility. And one of the things that I'll mention, which is sort of so interesting and is possibly a way forward, and I'll talk about kind of women artists in the present and the final thoughts, is that one of the things she struggles with the most is actually selling her work. So there are no real dealers who are specialized in 19th century American art at the time. She can't sort of find someone to be her commercial representative. So she might have time to do the painting, but she writes home to her mother that she doesn't have time to actually go out and represent herself to clients. Some of this has to do with, kind of male-controlled spaces and social clubs, but she just can't get away long enough to do the selling that needs to happen. So she tries workarounds, like creating prints that she can sell through a publisher, so some of it is, kind of handled by a firm that can do the commercial sides of things, but it just doesn't work. And she and her husband are really barely getting by. So, to go into the present, because I kind of want to bring all of this history back to, well, what might this mean for women artists today and women's artistic attainment? What we can see, and I'm showing you a screenshot from a really fantastic kind of ongoing work by an artist named Lenka Clayton. She calls this artist residency in motherhood, is that a lot of the issues that Lily Martin Spencer was facing in the 19th century, whether it is socializing as part of her kind of art world responsibilities, selling even in a world where we now have professionalized dealers, continue to hamper women artists. Or this one, I think Lenka Clayton says, she tries to work in, where's this? The fragmented focus of nat-length studio time, right? So as Claudia Golden's research has shown us about women, say bankers and lawyers today, or women in the workforce today, time constraint remains an issue. And it's an issue for women in the arts as well. And I think there are some kind of poignant examples of how this might come up, again, for artists today. So while I was writing this chapter, not only am I busy cataloging things to inspire me to write this chapter, there was a retrospective going on at the National Gallery of Art of work by Rachel White-Read, who's a British sculptor who won a majorly prestigious prize called the Turner Prize in 1992. And she won that prize for House, which I think you're seeing a study for here. And what was that sculpture? She actually took the time to cast an entire house that was going to be demolished, right? So a months-long project of taking plaster casts of this incredible, massive structure. Parts of it were in this retrospective. It's really incredible. And it's big, time-consuming, eye-catching work, and it made her career. Now, fast forward a little bit, and a work that I love just as much. She presented work from later in her career. This is 2007, 2008, lineup. And what are we looking at here? We're actually looking at the cast used toilet paper rolls from her household generated by her family, which at this point included 2 kids. And so what does she have time now to cast as she's kind of balancing family and career? She has time to cast used toilet paper rolls, quite a bit smaller than an entire house, and certainly less eye-catching. I mean, I think it's still very beautiful. But what I'd ask people to consider is that if Rachel White-Read had started her career not with the huge eye-catching house cast, right, but had started with the small nap-length sculpture in the form of lineup, would she be getting the same attention? Would the museums be collecting her? Would it be as impressive? And sadly, I think the answer might be no. And so, while the sexism of the 19th century, the Victorian Convention, the sense that, women should only paint flowers because it's polite might have since gone away, what I think we're still living with today and have to navigate is that time constraint is real for women artists. Its impact on their art is real. And we have to keep that in mind as we continue to form an artistic canon of art, this biased sample of works that make it into museums and make it into the textbooks, and hopefully contextualizing that with a little bit of data can help us understand what might be forming our choices and what gets famous. And so with that, I think I'm right at time. One more shameless plug for the book, and I would be happy to take questions. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was fascinating and exploration of lots of interesting ideas. And I would imagine we may have some people who have some questions for you. So we've got 2 microphones if you want to ask a question so that we can make sure our guests on Zoom hear. We can pass the mic to you and you can ask your question.
Thank you for that presentation. I'm intrigued by your ends. So just briefly, what's an average number of paintings by any particular artist, and how long does it take to make one? I was shocked to see hundreds rather than dozens.
That is a really interesting and highly variable question, right? So you have, first of all, it depends how long you're painting, right? So any artist who's gonna die at 27 inevitably is gonna produce less art. It also depends if we're counting, the Spencer data also includes the surviving drawings and watercolors that we have, right? So if you were to do just oil painting or works on paper included, that's gonna change. The honest answer is I don't know an average, and part of that is, I'll say, again, to the selection bias question, the artists for which we have a catalog raisonné, so that complete accounting, is reasonably limited, and is gonna be kind of your top tier of artists that generate scholarly interest, but hundreds is definitely not uncommon. Even for, I'm working on a project right now about Edouard Manet, and he's a pretty slow worker who's famous for making his sitters wait forever, and he's in the hundreds. So, but I will point you to a book by an economist named David Galenson called Old Masters, Young Geniuses, if I'm getting that right. But if you look up Galenson, it's his most famous book, and he actually uses kind of the curve of auction performance for certain artists to chart their different productivity patterns. He says they're kind of young they're conceptual artists who make all this innovation at first, are very productive early in their career and kind of drop off. And then you have tinkerers, Cezanne is a classic example, who kind of change their practice bit by bit by bit by bit, and end up kind of, in his case, with much more valuable works at the end of his career. But I say that only because he actually had to count all the works to do that. So that's probably your biggest sample of total output per artist.
Question is, so you're really starting with artists who are in a major museum, but there are a lot of other database. You could find all the artists in St. Louis who are in a gallery, because that's all computerized. Or you could see who's graduating from art school. And it would seem like you might get very different pictures if you're starting with a broad base of artists who start out represented, which is probably a fairly small number, and then make it into a major museum is a rarefied sample.
So to clarify, you're absolutely right, and to go back, we end up talking about the museum sample, but these guys are, 38,000, this is just still life paintings, by people who are art students. The National Academy of Design is an art school, so you're absolutely right. And these are largely anonymous people, and if you try to find the paintings, you can't. So, and that system, as you're quite rightly highlighting, persists today. If I were to kind of get all the information about all the BFA graduates in the US and what they're producing, and then figure out the number of them end up making it into a major institutional collection, it's going to be like a tiny, tiny number. And what I'm hoping to try and indicate is that that filtering process is something that's been going on since the 19th century and before. And so, yes, absolutely.
I'm curious to know if you ran any kind of a correlation ever between childless women and what they painted and women with children to see if there was a statistically significant tendency. I mean, it makes sense. But I'd like to know if there was big data, behind that conclusion. That they concentrated on the easily done still lives.
It's a really, really great question, and it is something I have not done but wish I had done, and I'll explain why. So when you look at the sample of women artists that we can consider, and I guess I could have done just women in museums and you'd have more biographical data, it is shockingly hard to find information about women and their biographies who end up in major museums. The other thing I'll say is Lily Martin Spencer is the outlier. There are most 19th century women artists are able to be as successful as they are because they choose not to marry. Often they're independently wealthy. Think about a Mary Cassatt. Rosa Bonheur, who's having a 19th century French artist, who's having a big retrospective in Paris right now, was queer. She was in, well, that's a little bit contested, but she was certainly in a partnership with another woman artist. The interesting thing there is that her longtime partner, Natalie Mikas, took a back seat to Rosa's career and really took care of the household. So even in a same-sex relationship, you have some of these dynamics where someone's shouldering the domestic responsibility at the expense of their career and someone is not. So I think it'd be a really interesting regression in the sense that you'd have very few observations, but it's a point well taken, and it's something that I should probably do. If you do like regressions and correlations, there are plenty of them in the book, primarily in the chapter about 19th century France. That has to do with the fact that the French government collects lots of statistics and always has since the 19th century.
So I'm not an art historian or anything, but I'm kind of curious if there's data on what I would consider the womanly arts, which I would imagine more women did, and they would be more represented and be more socially acceptable.
Do you mean like craft? Would
Yes.
that be, okay. So that's a fabulous question. I think gets to the heart of actually a lot of the other issues around selection bias in art history, right? Craft has not been maybe a focus of major art historical study for very long. I mean, it's changing, but also kind of having embroideries and decorative arts collections from 18th century America is something that I think curators are now getting wise to exactly for the reason you're highlighting, that women are more active in craft generally. So you would definitely capture more creativity, sort of women's creative output, were you to extend to craft. The difference, so the reason I can get data about 19th century women artists kind of at that first exhibition level when they're art students, let's say, is because there's a public exhibition of their work. Craft primarily, historically, is made in homes, right? So the point is, what I'm kind of getting at is, how can I actually get the information about women making these things? Like, where's that pamphlet that's printed so that I can record it? Now, there are examples, right? So like World's Fairs, you have things, yeah, right? And there's, I think it's Laura Prieto. Anyway, there's like a scholar, I'm pretty sure it's her chapter, she talks about butter sculpture in World's Fairs and women being very present in the butter sculpture arts, right? But I think so it's a point well taken, and it definitely, you can capture more women's artistic creativity that way. And as museums open up to showing that work, I think you include more women in the story.
First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. It's been fascinating. You talk a lot about still life as an example of where you can see these huge deltas. Were there other types of painting in which you found similar findings? And in sort of the bigger picture, how are museums responding to your findings overall?
So the deltas in like the other genres are largely in favor of men. The other place where women are really present are copies. So again, and if we think about the time dynamics of copies, right? If you're copying a painting, a kind of famous painting, either from a print version of it, or if it happens to be in a local collection, same kind of issue. You can kind of come and go as you please, presuming that the copyist hours work for you. But when it came to kind of like history, portrait, genre, it's very, very male-dominated, which is sort of interesting. I'm glad that you asked about how are museums responding, because I did have an extra slide on here. Very end, past the thank you, okay. So something that was really cool is the NGA at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, actually a month after I left my job there, but I got to come back to do this, did what we call the datathon. I wasn't allowed to call it a hackathon because it was the federal government and they said I couldn't use the word hack, but that's okay. And they got really interested in what their collections data, so that kind of export from the back end, could tell them about the makeup of their collection. And so we had teams come in to work with the data sets and like just tell us interesting things. And this is one really interesting one. This is actually a group of undergraduates. Their professors also participated in their own team. And I have to say the undergrads, I think, did a little bit better. But they, by this kind of classification, which was a category in the NGA cataloging data, looked at the presence of women in, kind of the proportion of women in these different categories of art. And what you find really quickly, and it's going to resonate with the data from the American wing, is women are really present in photographs and prints. And this is something that we actually see across different collections. So works on paper are actually your most diverse areas. This is actually holds true for artists of color often as well. And so something that was really cool is that after doing this event, I don't know how it worked out because I don't work there anymore, but the senior curator of photography felt really emboldened to make a really strong argument to give her lots of budget and lots of galleries to show all these women artists, right? And so I do think there is some interest from museums in like getting to know their collections in this different way, and how can that maybe guide some decisions about who gets gallery space, or so slowly but surely, yeah.
This will be our final question.
Have you been able to tease out class while you're doing this research? And if how does that impact your data or your findings?
That's also a really great question. I've been able to tease out, with respect to the women artists, like teasing out class has been largely a qualitative question. But what I will say is what's clear is what facilitates many women artists and their ability to succeed is being rich already. So there are kind of two factors. Lily Martin Spencer, again, an outlier, but often they're from a family where maybe their father was a painter or an artist and they managed to train them. So that's the case of Rosa Bonheur, the French artist I mentioned. And the second thing is if you were independently wealthy, it helped a whole heck of a lot. So Mary Cassatt is the classic example. But beyond that, in terms of like actual numbers, I haven't been able to tease it out, but I think it's a great question, because of course diversity is not just gender, right? It's also your class background, it's race, it's all these different things. And I think there's kind of endless potential to try and code some of that information.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diana, and thank you all for joining us this evening.